I handed out a copy of my paper. It's basically a critique of ASEAN's effort to manage the dispute in the South China Sea. And I thought you could read the case in some detail that I make there, as opposed to me going through the details of that case, especially chronologically, at 4 o'clock in the afternoon is probably not the best approach here. So I thought you could read that on your own time and see if what I say makes sense, and that I would just hit a couple high points, make a few observations that I drew from researching and pulling that paper together. First off, the thing that strikes me the most about ASEAN's handling of this problem is its persistence in the face of what is obvious failure in several different aspects, and the paper focuses on three in particular. One, on the code of conduct. I also am in favor of some sort of code of conduct being negotiated, as is the U.S. government. It's really one of the few reeds that we have to hold on to in terms of some hope for resolving the problem. Well, not really resolving it. What we're trying to do is find a way to manage it. As I think someone said earlier, it won't be resolved but by our grandchildren and great-grandchildren, if never. And it really doesn't matter if it's resolved in the end, as long as we don't fight about it and people can develop the resources and access them to the degree that they want to in some fairness. But what ASEAN has failed to do, I think, is appreciate what's necessary to get to a code of conduct. If they did appreciate it, we would be much closer than we are. You look back, they've worked on this now for 20 years, literally 20 years. First came up in 1992 in the Philippines at the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. They worked on it for 10 years after that. Until 2002, when we got the Declaration of Conduct, itself basically a failure to reach a code of conduct. Code of conduct was impossible because, for various reasons, but because the Chinese refused to include the paracels in that agreement, and unless you included the paracels, it wouldn't make sense. So it ended up referencing the whole region. And became non-binding declaration. Of course, the very stipulation that that is the Chinese stipulation to ASEAN, that you have to include the paracels, is basically making a condition that they know that ASEAN can't meet. That ASEAN can't very well meet as a body and declare the interest of one of its members, particularly Vietnam, invalid in order to reach agreement. Then you go 10 more years, or you go to 2011, basically, 9 years, where we finally got some movement on guidelines. Again, basically a failure to reach a more substantial agreement. The guidelines themselves, very short, all fits on one piece of paper. All it is another restatement when it comes to code of conduct. All is another restatement of the need for a code of conduct. And it has some aspirations about the sort of joint projects and things that can be undertaken. I would say that's extremely meager returns for 20 years worth of work and 20 years worth of diplomatic energy. And there is a lot of energy involved in these things. Meetings throughout the years. I mean, all of those years, off and on, sometimes with no meetings, but they involved a whole lot of work. The second place I think that ASEAN has failed in this in managing this problem is an application of UNCLOS. We talked a lot about UNCLOS today in the earlier sessions. Going back to 1996, UNCLOS has been raised as a basis for resolving this dispute, and it's been agreed by China since 1996 that they would resolve this problem, or again manage it according to UNCLOS. The fact that today the crux of the issue is a Chinese claim that is completely out of keeping with UNCLOS, I think is testament to the failure. I mean, the whole problem now is that the Chinese claims are defined in a way that are not in keeping. We heard that in the earlier presentation, that in fact one of the great benefits of the Filipinos' action to take the case to an arbitral panel is that it may require the Chinese to refine their claim and put it in things that are explicitly, put it in terms that are explicitly referenced to UNCLOS. As we all know, so far the Chinese have declined to participate in that proceeding, rejected the basis for it. The third area I think ASEAN has failed in this regard is in instituting the norm of self-restraint. ASEAN has done an incredible job, historic job really, in instituting this restraint within ASEAN. It's really ASEAN's great accomplishment over the last 40 years is to create a security community. Now they're going to officially in 2015 declare their security community, but in the sort of small e, small c sense, a security, well, that's economic community, but in terms of a small s, security and community, c, they have, they've already achieved it. They don't go to war with each other for the most part, little skirmishes here and there, but they manage to resolve things peacefully. They have failed to bring the Chinese into that, and that is explicitly their aim. You listen to any of the ASEAN foreign ministers over the years, you look at the ASEAN statements, they are basically trying to socialize. I don't mean that in a condescending way, but I mean that's the way they think of socialize Chinese behavior so that it will behave similarly to ASEAN parties in resolution of disputes and the way that they pursue their interests in the region. If you look at, and the reason why I say that they failed in that regard is if you look at the number of incidents. Ambassador Hill pointed out earlier, and it's really quite interesting, he's right that his time in office coincided with a time that was very quiet in the South China Sea. I'm not sure it's because of anything he did, although it could, you never know. I'm not sure why it is, but the truth is there was a long period of time after 2002 up until about 2010, 2011 that was relatively quiet. And then 2011, the incidents began to pick up, and they continued in through 2012. The way that the incidents broke down in terms of their numbers and their frequencies, and I point this out in the paper, and their relation to the ASEAN meeting schedule is pretty interesting. Several events occurred in February and March of 2011, none in April, and then 6 followed in Jakarta in May 2011. The Scarborough Shoal standoff began in April, immediately following the ASEAN summit, and was resolved the month before the July meetings of the ASEAN foreign minister meetings. The flare-ups with Vietnam in 2012 also occurred in June, just before the ASEAN ministerial meetings, the foreign ministers meetings. And then there were no incidents after that until after the summit in November. You can read it there yourself, establishing the pattern here, but there is some pattern of incidents that occur up to ASEAN meetings with some gap to allow things to calm down, and then incidents after the meetings. I don't think you can sort of empirically point to a trend there. It's not causality, but it is a high degree of correlation in the way these things have worked out. What that means to me is that maybe in the Scarborough Shoal incident, ASEAN mishandled it completely, and the U.S. was complicit in their mishandling of it. Perhaps the thing to do wasn't to resolve the problem before the ASEAN foreign ministers met. Maybe the thing to do was to allow the dispute to roll into the foreign ministers meeting. So instead of basically allowing the Chinese off the hook for what was going on during that meeting, make it awkward. And this is another problem with ASEAN, is that ASEAN doesn't like awkward situations. They would prefer that things get settled before their meeting. They can have a big happy meeting, and then afterwards the Chinese can press their claims again, and and they can worry about it again at that point until the next meeting, and they'll make sure everything gets resolved before then and go to the next meeting. Now, I say the U.S. was complicit in that because, of course, the U.S. intervened and encouraged the Chinese to pull out and encouraged the Filipinos to pull out. The Filipinos did pull out. The Chinese didn't pull out. And it's not entirely clear that the U.S. made its views known when it consulted with Beijing on this as clearly as some of us might wish that they did. Now, what explains some of these things? I think there's a matter of ASEAN culture involved, that is its diplomatic culture over the years. They're very proud of their ability to manage disputes. And they have a proud intellectual tradition of sort of a liberal internationalism of sort, and a faith in that they think is going to work ultimately to bring resolution here. I think there's also a certain amount of hubris involved, especially among the big members of ASEAN. That is that we have handled these before, we've handled these things before, we'll handle it again this time. You just don't understand because you're a Westerner, you're an American, we're handling it in an ASEAN way. And that ASEAN way is fine for Singapore and Indonesia, but it's not fine for the Philippines. You know, the ASEAN way is not working for the Philippines, it's not working for Vietnam particularly well either. Another reason I think that, another thing that explains this failure on the part of ASEAN is that it has many divided interests within its organization. Hardly any two ASEAN countries see this dispute quite the same way. You often see it broken down in terms of claimant state and non-claimant states. There's a little bit of truth to that, but there's also disagreements among the claimants themselves, not just over the territory, but over the approach to the issue. The Bruneians have a very small claim, so they're chair this year. How is that going to play out? It's probably not going to play out with the Bruneians repeating 2010 and being as assertive as the Vietnamese were. The Bruneians, I think, will likely just go along. I mean, their aim will be to have a ASEAN year that is uneventful. They won't care that it produces nothing as long as it doesn't result in crisis. Doesn't result in crisis, they're happy, they go on, they hand the chair over to somebody else, and it's all somebody else's problem. And that, when they do make that transition, they transition it to Burma. The chair goes to Burma. What does Burma care about the South China Sea? They could care less about the South China Sea. They care a lot about the Chinese, and so you will see their activity in the chair proceed accordingly, I think. I think their overriding interest in their chairmanship year will be just pulling it off and showing the world that they are the chair of ASEAN and that they can handle it, and that will be their highest priority. They don't want anything to mess that up. 2015, the Malaysians will be the chair. 2015 is also the year where all of the various communities come together. It's the completion year. It will be a celebration year, okay? I mean, this is a celebration. It doesn't matter if economic community is there or not, okay? It doesn't matter if security community, it doesn't matter what is going on, they're gonna celebrate. And they're not going to allow this to get in the way, I can promise you that. Then in 2016, the Laotians will be in the chair. And I think for the Laotians, 2016 is a world away. I mean, it is a long way away. And between now and then, they will basically just go along with whatever the consensus is in ASEAN. I think you have an interesting, another interesting class of ASEAN members that I'll call the stakeholders. Some of them are more or less in this category, but I'm thinking principally of Singapore and Indonesia. ASEAN was founded basically, one of the 3 or 4 principal reasons for ASEAN, it was founded to keep the Indonesians in. Keep the Indonesians, it's like NATO founding to keep Germany in. That's why ASEAN was founded. So in exchange for that, it gave Indonesia an outsized role, actually not outsized according to its size. It is by far the largest member. It's really the center of gravity of ASEAN, but it gave them a large leadership role. So the Indonesians' principal interest is in keeping ASEAN running far into the future. That's where they derive their legitimacy. The legitimacy for their regional leadership is that they are the big, powerful country in ASEAN, and that ASEAN continues as a as an effective group, or at least a group that can make some sort of pretense towards effectiveness. So the Indonesians, as long as they are assured by the Chinese that the dispute doesn't affect them, they're not really concerned about finding a solution either. It looks, it looks a little bad for them that this thing continues to click on, but I don't think within ASEAN it matters that much. No one within ASEAN is criticizing them that their chairmanship year did not result in some big progress on the COC. They started their chairmanship by the year declaring that it was going to be done that year, which I don't know why they thought after 20 years suddenly they were going to be able to pull it off. Singapore, I think, is also one of these stakeholders because Singapore is the opposite end of the spectrum. For Singapore, ASEAN, well, keeping Indonesia in actually helped Singapore to a large degree. Singapore is the smallest member, one of the smallest members of ASEAN, one of the most powerful. It's one of the most vulnerable, actually. A Chinese dot in a Malay sea, as they call it. So Singapore has a major interest in ASEAN continuing in order to be able to protect it from all the forces around it. So they also have an interest in a pretense towards effectiveness. It's interesting that at the end of 2010, when many of us thought that we were finally making some headway in ASEAN standing up to Chinese claims, by the end of the year, the biggest critics that the Vietnamese face were not outside of ASEAN. They were the Singaporeans and the Indonesians and everyone who said they had gone too far. And they were the people talking to our State Department, encouraging the State Department to ease off of this sort of thing. And that's why after 2010, there wasn't much more fireworks on the U.S. side. Obviously, the Philippines and the Indonesians are, the Vietnamese and the Filipinos are the big stakeholders in that they have, they actually have a dispute. They have the most sizable claims at stake. I think the Philippines probably in the most dire situation in that. And that the Vietnamese also have a good relationship with the Chinese. I think sometimes we overestimate a little bit how much at odds the Vietnamese are with the Chinese. They actually have a good relationship, and in the middle of all these disputes, the General Secretary still finds time to go to Beijing and have big signing ceremonies about principles of solving conflicts and that sort of thing. So I don't rule out the Vietnamese ability to work this issue with the Chinese. And in fact, sometimes behind closed doors, the Vietnamese will criticize the Filipinos just to make sure that they know what, how bad the Filipinos are. It's interesting, but it's sort of a rite of passage. It's sort of like what gives you the right to speak about this issue is that you can agree that the Filipinos are the ones causing all the problems, and so the Vietnamese will pull into that port every once in a while, just like everybody else. That's been my experience. The paper goes through some detail on the impact of economic ties. I don't think that's something that you can overlook. We do something at Heritage called the China Investment Tracker, where we're tracking Chinese investments around the world. It includes Chinese investments, also contracts, and it shows ASEAN as the #1 destination for Chinese capital when you include contracts. And in Indonesia, it's got this long history of diplomacy that predisposes it to the sort of behavior, the sort of leadership within ASEAN. It's also the biggest recipient of Chinese investment, $25 billion in investment, which is a lot of money. Same with Brunei. I don't think you're going to buy the Sultan of Brunei's position on this issue, but you can't go without noting that the Chinese have a $6 billion investment there, $2.5 billion, which is already going into the ground. At the end, what I come to is that I come to the realization that failure to me is not necessarily failure to ASEAN, and that's a pretty big problem, because failure to me is that this dispute's going to go on indefinitely with no solution. That's not ASEAN's definition of failure. Cambodia did very well last year. ASEAN did not fail last year for Cambodia. They're getting a lot of money from the Chinese. They consulted extensively with the Chinese in both crises that arose, the one in July and then another one in November, over the contents of consensus positions on what occurred in those meetings. And it's getting paid handsomely for those positions. It's not failing for the Indonesians or the Singaporeans. As long as ASEAN continues as a going concern, it's working. It's managing this problem appropriately. It is failing for the Philippines, and it's failing to some degree for the Vietnamese. Why this matters to the United States is that our interest is in seeing some sort of solution. We've invested a lot now in ASEAN-centric security architecture. We've invested a lot of diplomatic capital in it. And this problem in the South China Sea is the biggest test that diplomatic architecture faces. If it's not going to work, I think the U.S. has to start making alternative plans. We don't have an interest in just doing the things that ASEAN wants us to do. We have, our biggest issue in East Asia is the challenge of bringing China into a system that will moderate its behavior over the long term and allow us all to reach our mutual interests. We don't have an interest in allowing this to continue and allow ASEAN to have parties and that sort of thing. We have real things that we need to get done, and we're investing a lot in it. The end of the testimony, the end of the my paper does talk about some of the alternatives, some things that we can do, and I hope we can talk about that in the question and answer. But basically, I think if ASEAN is to recover on this, they've got to start manipulating the factors in different ways. They've got to start introducing new things. That does mean internationalizing the dispute, if we want to use that term. That means bringing in new parties. That means changing the basic power structure that's involved here. If the power structure continues as it is, and it's only going against ASEAN in the long run, this problem will only get worse and worse. We have to find new ways to change that power structure, new factors to manipulate, and new venues for finding solutions. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed for a very lucid, clear, pulling no punches presentation. And we will now turn to perhaps a slightly different perspective from Professor Jing Huang. He told me earlier he doesn't claim any credit for this presentation. He agrees with nearly all of it, and he's going to tell us when he does not completely agree with what he's actually presenting to us.
Yeah. Can we have the PowerPoint?
Yes, we'll do that.
Actually, like the chairman said, I'm here to present a paper on behalf of my colleague, Professor Heng Yikwang, who unfortunately was sick and could not make the trip. As a result, I'm here to present on his behalf. Having said that, I did have some discussion with Yikwang about this paper. Again, I agree with most of what he has to say, and I will be dutifully represent his opinion and his points here. But in the questions and answers, since he's not here, I cannot claim all the mistake I'm going to make on his behalf. So questions and answers, that'll be my thinking. Let me go from here. Where it goes? How to move this? No. Sorry. Oh, here. Okay. Stupid me. I think that to start with, we know ASEAN was not a rule-based institution or regime. ASEAN is a gathering of the Southeast Asian countries for communication, consultation, and coordination on the issues that are important for the countries involved. So therefore, the two core principles in ASEAN, number one is neutrality or centrality. And number two, of course, is consensus building. Consensus is very important for ASEAN to exist. But however, the South China Sea issue has brought ASEAN to test on the two fundamental principles of ASEAN. Number one is can ASEAN maintain its so-called neutrality in the whole dispute? And number two, how can ASEAN maintain the so-called consensus on this issue, which is at the heart of ASEAN as an organization? Indeed, Professor Heng Yi Kwang want to address three issues. Is number one, does ASEAN has a position on the Southeast Asia, South China Sea dispute? If it does, what it is. Number two, what are the difficulties and the internal contradictions, or he called obstacles, to maintain this so-called position? And then last but not the least, what are the implications or consequences for all those problems ASEAN encountered on the South China Sea issue? Here, does ASEAN has a common position? Indeed, ASEAN realized early on that South China Sea issue is a very important issue. So as early as 1992, ASEAN has issued the Declaration of South China Sea, trying to tackle this issue head-on. And because of that, at that time, only 6 countries, and later on, of course, become 10 of them to work on, and take 10 years. It took 10 years for ASEAN eventually work out a declaration of conduct of parties in South China Sea. In this declaration of our DOC, it has several principles. Number one is, of course, no use of force, and which means that you have to be solved, the issue has to be solved on peaceful means. And second, it urged all the parties to exercise self-constraints, don't go to extremes. And then, very importantly, that's where ASEAN value is to, here. Okay, let me get rid of this one. How to get rid of this one? Okay, is to confidence building the trust. That is, people have to get to understand each other before they can solve the issues, and then move towards peaceful solution. And then we have this, and another target or mission for this DOC is to eventually work out on the principles, on the spirit of those to work out the COC, the Code of Conduct. Having said that, and this is what the 6-point principles was that number one, all the parties agree by 2012, the deadline is November, the COC has to be signed. Number two, to reaffirm all the commitment, all the principles laid out by the DOC, and then push towards eventual peaceful solution of all of this. Having said that, let me emphasize, that's what Yi Kwang wanted me to emphasize. From the very beginning, ASEAN realized the limits, the constraints of its mission. That is, either DOC or COC is not for solution, because solution is in the hand of involved parties, not ASEAN. But DOC or COC is meant for management, because we know that our human beings have only 2 kinds of problems. Problem number one, the first kind of problem, you can solve it. Then you try, you find a solution. The second kind of problem is that no matter how hard you work on it, you still cannot solve it. Then you come to management. So this COC or DOC is for management to provide a platform that is for the eventual solution, peaceful solution for the South China Sea issue. So therefore, there's some but. Although ASEAN plays a very active role from the very beginning, it has made it clear that number one, ASEAN does not take any official position on the territory dispute. And number two, ASEAN does not want to take sides on those disputes. And number three, that ASEAN wants to be neutral and impartial on all those claims. And in other words, the members of ASEAN emphasize the so-called tradition of ASEAN centrality or neutrality. And despite all of this, ASEAN wants to play a leading role in resolving regional political and security issues. This means setting up a framework that is based on COC or DOC that would help to facilitate the involved parties to find the eventual solution by peaceful means. In other words, collectively, ASEAN does not want to take a position. is a collective actor, but it wants to help to find a solution. As we can see, there's some internal or inner contradictions, problems already built in, like Yi Kuang is going to point out. First, the difficulty is how can ASEAN as a collective actor maintain neutral when the individual member in this collectiveness has some problem with China or even the frontline states like Philippines, Vietnam, and to some extent Brunei, Malaysia. That is 4 most important members of ASEAN already have a problem. A second problem is, of course, among those 4 member countries have a problem or have the dispute with China and Taiwan, Vietnam and the Philippines are more active in this because they've been challenged or pushed from their point of view by China, a rising China. And last but thirdly is that among ASEAN members, those who directly involved in the dispute and those who doesn't have any claim in the South China Sea obviously have different expectations and different interests. And for example, right on the issue of COC and how ASEAN can get China involved, should all the ASEAN countries come to talk with each other, reach a consensus, achieve a common position, and then approach China, or let China involved from the very beginning as kind of participating players in all of this. This is very problematic because if ASEAN has to reach a consensus, then dealing with China, it already take a position. It already takes sides from China's point of view or even from ASEAN country point of view, number one. Number two, which is kind of nuanced here, we have to understand, but difficult, that is a lot of ASEAN countries have certain relationships with China, economically, politically, and so on and so forth. They do not want to be seen as siding with countries like Vietnam or Philippines by approaching China. They want to make it clear, my position is only to this point. I don't want to get any further. They want to talk to China. So even they can reach a consensus, some private talking on the table the negotiation or communication already started with China. So as a result, you can see the position ASEAN trying to take from the very beginning is very problematic. It's kind of conflict-ridden, just like Professor Luhmann just elegantly pointed out. So as a result, because all these difficulties, immediately they have some major differences among the ASEAN countries. For example, Vietnam and the Philippines want to emphasize peaceful resolution, want to emphasize on self-restraint, and emphasize a kind of united approach towards China. But China, on the other hand, emphasize on the confidence building and the cooperation on development issues, environmental issues. Of course, China is very clever on this because confidence building means bilateral approach, not multilateral approach. And again, we have countries like Cambodia, Thailand, and Laos to a certain extent kind of lean towards China's position, saying the COC or DOC should emphasize on confidence building. We have other countries lean towards, I guess it's Malaysia and Brunei lean towards Philippines and Vietnam's position. We emphasize on self-restraint and also emphasize on peaceful solution. So as a result, they open themselves up to China for so-called divide and rule kind of rule. And actually China took full advantage of this. And China's strategy, of course, like we discussed before, China insists on the bilateral approach in finding a solution or in management. And China also emphasizes on the confidence building rather than self-restraint. And all of that, of course, China successfully divided ASEAN. And like Professor Luhmann just said, in July 2012, for the first time, ASEAN failed to achieve a joint stance, to fail to issue a joint statement. And that's what is here. And now, what is an even more difficult problem? That is procedures. Because ASEAN's principles, so-called consensus building platform for communication, consultation, and coordination, emphasize the important role played by the chairman country. That is, the chairman country is in charge of drafting all the documents during the ASEAN summit. And then two problems involved. Number one, the procedure itself turned out to be very problematic because ASEAN members tend to be chair country, and by 2012, it happens to be Cambodia. And the second, of course, not all the chairman country have experience about this. Not all of them really understand situations that other member countries understand. They have differences. As a result, even procedures has become a problem. In other words, like I said before, ASEAN is not rule-based institution, and therefore procedures cannot stand the scrutiny when there is a problem like South China Sea issue. As a result, ASEAN's so-called consensus building failed, divergence prevailed. And again, we have all those problems. And now, the third area that make so-called ASEAN principles or ASEAN behavior so difficult is the great power getting involved into the South China Sea issue. We know that one of the major principles of ASEAN is to maintain neutrality. But when United States get involved, when China has become increasingly assertive or even aggressive on the South China Sea issue, when the kind of conflict between China and countries like Vietnam and the Philippines become, more and more serious, tension has become lingering, then even Japan got involved. So therefore, naturally, the ASEAN member countries will have a tendency either lean towards China, as Thailand and the Cambodians, or some countries like the Philippines and the Vietnam naturally will try to find help from the United States or from Japan. So this kind of taking no side position is totally ruined because individual members of ASEAN already take side not only with themselves, but with the major powers who are involved in the problem. So we have two layers of problems. Layer number one, you said I don't take side, I don't take a position. But individual members of your organization are already on one side because they are the side. And layer number two problem is that when the major powers get involved, different countries, different member countries tends to take different sides. So all of this, so let me repeat, is the internal problems, procedure problems, and great power involvement. All of this make ASEAN a mission impossible. And what's the implications or the consequence? Is first, of course, is about the centrality or neutrality. Can it be maintained, especially when they're facing such a major issue in terms of security. And secondly, is that the consensus also being challenged because they have different interests. But how to apply so-called ASEAN principles, that is no intervention, peaceful solutions, so on and so forth, on a non-member state like China who are very much involved in the South China Sea issue. And although China also signed this kind of so-called TAC, but which means three principles. Peaceful means no use of force, non-intervention, intervention, etc., etc. But the problem is that there is an implication that if member countries of ASEAN cannot solve their problems, they can go for the higher council to solve. As a matter of fact, when Singapore and Malaysia had a dispute, they go to international court to solve the issues. So that's why there is a kind of innate building mechanism to encourage the ASEAN countries to solve their dispute or problems among themselves in accordance with international law. However, when Philippines went to international court, immediately the strongest opposition actually coming from ASEAN, from countries like Singapore, Thailand, so on and so forth. Just like, I think you might remember what Ambassador Roy said in the panel last night. His nuance, he's a diplomat, but nuance is very clear. That is right exactly what Yi-Kuan said. Oh, sorry. Let me put back here. The approach, the tribunal of UN conversation on law of state that examine China rejected. Manila bypassed the ASEAN framework. Bypass is a very serious word in my view. In other words, Filipinos did not really have so-called agreement, did not really coordinate with other ASEAN members when they go to international court. But on the other hand, ASEAN members fully understand Philippines' position. That is, they have tried everything possible in terms of territory dispute with China, but all of this ways being exhausted, produce nothing meaningful. So therefore, according to Manila, going to tribunal is a last resort, try to find a peaceful solution for the dispute they have with China. But the problem is that it challenges very core issue of ASEAN centrality and ASEAN's consensus building. And of course, Singapore, Yi-Kuan is a Singaporean, and Lee Kuan Yew School is located and based in Singapore. So therefore, we take Singapore's position very seriously. That's what the Singapore's position very telling. That is, the nuance here, if you look at all of this, Singapore has some position, has some problems by Manila's approach, especially when the major newspaper in Philippines claimed that Singapore was consulted and means that Singapore at least is not opposed to Manila's approach. And Singapore immediately said, no, we are not approached. We kind of not supportive to Manila's approach because this is not an ASEAN position. I mean, to go to the tribunal is not ASEAN's position. It's Philippines' position, no more, no less. That's what it is. And the conclusion, obviously conclusion already stand there. ASEAN's core values, neutrality, centrality, and the consensus is under severe scrutiny, is under severe test. And how we can go from there, and we don't know. Right now, it seems there is some acceptable opinion or approach. That is, we try to get China sit down at the table of COC, try to continue the effort started as early as 1992. And meanwhile, ASEAN want to make clear to China, COC is not for resolution of the problem. COC is a code of management. To manage the situation to such extent, number one, the tension will not escalate into confrontation. Number two, we provide a platform or a forum that for the involved parties to find a peaceful revolution. Because there is a nuance here. China's position is that bilateral approach for a solution, but China will not get into multilateral negotiation for a solution. And ASEAN's position from Singapore's point of view, that's fine, we understand. That's why COC is not a solution. COC is just for management. Solution or not depends on the negotiation between Chinese and Filipinos, between Chinese and Vietnamese, but ASEAN only get involved into agreement for management. That's it, no more, no less. That's what kind of idealistic solution that from ASEAN's point of view, still, finally, let's see, again, from Yi-Kuan's point, there is a very high stake. The first and foremost is about China's image. I said that in the opening remarks. That is, as a rising power, how China is seen as a player in the international system, especially in terms of international legal regimes. And second, of course, is, again, using Prime Minister Li Hsien-loong's word, many countries are watching closely, because what is at stake is not just ASEAN's values, like consensus or neutrality, but also the credibility of ASEAN as an international institution regime, and more importantly, the very survival of ASEAN on this issue. And another issue that is very, very high is that when ASEAN is involved, how a rising China, a global player, global power China, can deal with an international institution such as ASEAN, which is very important, not only for China's external environment, but also for China's image. And that is Yiquan's point. Again, I agree with him. I think he's right. He has did a very good job on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, perhaps I'll abuse my privilege by starting off with a question for each of the speakers. We heard reference to this idea that war doesn't break out between ASEAN countries, but skirmishes possibly do. And I suppose in this context, as someone whose primary interest is in Thailand, I do inevitably start to think of the little Cambodian-Thai border disputes that have actually resulted in quite a number of fatalities recently. Given ASEAN's track record in what we might call skirmish management or skirmish resolution, is there cause for concern that if we had similar sorts of skirmishes breaking out in this part of the region, ASEAN would also struggle, to put it politely, to respond effectively to those? That's for you.
Sure. Yes, I do think it's a reason for concern. I think it's a reason for concern because there aren't the mechanisms in place to handle the current skirmishes. So I do think there's a certain amount of assurance in all of the interaction that the ASEAN ministers have at all levels, all the way up to the leaders level. I think the fact that the Cambodians and the Thais have to see each other many times a year, 2 times foreign ministers, a couple times at the leaders level, I think that, and the history of ASEAN and its principles, I think, has effectively socialized their foreign policies. The problem is that they have not been successful at extending that beyond ASEAN. And I agree with you. There is, obviously there have been skirmishes, and the Cambodia-Thai situation probably the most prominent in the last several years. But when you look at the scale of the sort of conflicts that were happening just outside of ASEAN many years ago, Cambodia and Vietnam, that sort of thing. I mean, it's really small type of conflict.
I think that's a very quick. Again, in the question and answers, it's not equal. It's mine, and I cannot. I think that on the skirmish involve two factors. Number one is, of course, with the ASEAN as organization has this capability to prevent skirmish, and that's number one. And the history shows that ASEAN does not really have accurate capability to prevent skirmish. Otherwise, we'll not have all those issues. But what is more important to me is that ASEAN as an international institution, very important in the region, does ASEAN has a capability to control escalation? I think that's what really, really matters. We know accident happened, but for example, between major powers, either China, Japan, or either China, United States, what matters is not that they can prevent a skirmish or tension from taking place. What really matters is that those powers have a mechanism and a capability to control escalation so that it will not escalate into a massive confrontation. But can you imagine a scenario when, for example, let me put it this way, when Vietnamese or Filipinos by accident fired and China fight back 10 times strong or 100 times strong, and goes there, what ASEAN going to do? I think that in the crisis management, we all know what really matters is not to prevent a crisis from happening, but to control the escalation. And that's where the problem is. I do not think that ASEAN has any capability at all to control escalation if a really crisis emerges.
Just make one quick point. I agreed with virtually everything that Professor Huang said in his presentation, to a remarkable degree, actually. But the one thing I will point out, that the High Council has never been used. You know, it was mentioned that it has never been used because it requires consensus. So it's essentially the meeting of all of the heads of state, and none of them are going to, you know, as long as the guy who's a problem sitting at the table, he's not going to agree to whatever the outcome is. So the formal processes are actually not operational. It's really this informal, this gathering, the contact that makes ASEAN successfully avoid dispute.
Yeah, I guess I did not explain Yiquan accurately. What Yiquan said, exactly because the High Council is impossible. That's why the Filipinos goes to the international court. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm very much here to learn. This is not my main area of interest, but the main thing I learned just now was that there are two kinds of problems facing human beings: the problems that we are able to solve by one way or another, and those that we're not able to solve. And were you yourself coming down and saying this was an insoluble problem? Because at the end, I was still trying to work out which of the two kinds of problems we were on. And also, is there a difference between managing a problem and solving it? Are there unmanageable problems and manageable problems? And if so, in which category is this one?
I say this because I talked with both Chinese and Vietnamese and even Filipinos on that matter, because sometimes the difference seems to be in kind, not in degree. That's why, if I read correctly, and General Zhu Cheng, who is sitting right here, China is trying to maintain status quo. When you try to maintain status quo, you go for management. You go for the solution. And that reminds me about, for example, on the Taiwan issue or North Korean nuclear issue. North Korean nuclear issue is an issue we have to solve. That's why I try to work so hard. But on the Taiwan issue, it actually serves the involved parties' best interest to let the issue remain as such. That means status quo is good. So sometimes international, I'm talking from international political view. Sometimes to maintain status quo is actually a solution in itself, because it manages the existing problem to such extent that this problem will not escalate into a major problem.
Thank you very much. Okay, I had one at the back there. Yeah, sorry, over here. Yes, please.
Patrick Cronin from the Center for New American Security. Thank you for the presentations, but the effect of both of those presentations was to convince me of the limitations of ASEAN, its founding, what it can't do, and what it's not going to do. So could you restate positively, perhaps, what is it exactly that ASEAN can do to not resolve, but manage the disputes in the South China Sea? Briefly, what still can we expect, especially for those outside of ASEAN?
Well, I mean, putting it positively, recognizing you have a problem is the first step, right? So I think I don't think it's wrong to point out the big problem we have in ASEAN, and I know you're not suggesting that, but I mean that's the cause. That's the cause here. That's why I pointed out, is to find a new way. You know, I think, you know, hopefully we'll talk about this at some length tomorrow. That is, what are the other options? But I think that the parties to the dispute have to start reaching outside of their immediate region, looking for new mechanisms. Bring in the South Koreans, bring in the Japanese, bring in the Americans. Have some international. How about an international conference which can talk about the dispute and then report back into ASEAN? You can have some kind of reporting mechanism back into ASEAN. But that's the sort of thing. You get an international mediator, someone completely from outside the region. You know, some of the lawyers in here might have a good idea of where that basis would be, but get somebody completely out, have meetings in Switzerland or something to try to sort this out. But I just think we have to recognize that we have reached ASEAN's limit, I think, and we've got to start thinking about some new ways to handle it.
I want to say it from a little bit positive perspective. I think ASEAN's very existence, first and foremost, is a foundation for self-restraint for its member countries, because ASEAN's principle is a no use of force, no intervention, so on and so forth. So as a member countries, for example, Philippines and Vietnamese, if they want to resort to the force, which is very unlikely in my view, they have to think about the membership of ASEAN, because ASEAN has very strict demand on that. But on the other hand, even to China, which is not ASEAN member, China has to consider seriously, if China want to fire the first shot, use force, then what is offended will no longer be Filipinos or Vietnamese, but the entire ASEAN as organization, because after all, that's a core value of ASEAN. So in that regard, I think ASEAN can still play some positive roles in terms of non-use of force. And in other words, it can still lay some constraints on all the parties involved. That's first. And secondly, I think because the existence of ASEAN as institution, as international institutions and so forth, it actually limited a kind of influence or the role outsider, I mean United States, Japan, or India, so on, can play in this area, which you can argue that it works for China's advantage. But on the other hand, it also made it clear for China that you cannot use this ASEAN issue as a way to deal with Chinese. This part I beg to disagree with General Chu Cheng-hu this morning. That is, ASEAN, for the ASEAN countries, is not and should not be a playground for major powers in their contest for power or influence whatsoever. Not what, in my view, is in the last analysis, is what neutrality really means.
Okay, we had another question at the back. Yes.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Henry Bensurta from the Philippines. I'd like to make 3 quick points, but I'd like to preface those 3 questions with a situation. It's very unfortunate in some instances when somebody is raped, actually, the blame is put on the woman because the woman wears miniskirt, and that's why he caused the rape. Having said that, let me say this. I don't see how the Philippines, small as it is, could provoke and could fire the first shot. I think one only has to look at the facts. Who went where? Who did what? And these are facts, and this can be verified. Second point, with respect to the statement that the Philippines actually bypassed ASEAN, let me put this in the context. I think the Philippines did not bypass ASEAN, even on the case of arbitration. ASEAN, the Philippines has always put a premium on ASEAN and has always put its initiative within the ASEAN organization. Factually, we put the SOFIC in the table of ASEAN. Factually, we made a proposal for a workshop that involves China. Factually, we made a proposal, if that could not happen, a 4-claimant state. I'm not go into the details of how this failed. You can make your assumptions. But the fact is, with respect to the joint communique, we tried to put the idea of the South China Sea within the backyard within the table of ASEAN. And last year, for example, I don't want to put any country on the spot, but let me state for a fact that we wanted something on a statement on the Scarborough, a factual statement, but ASEAN could not agree on that, actually. And so the question, therefore, and this was the tenor of the debate, how can ASEAN maintain its centrality and solidarity and could talk about the issue in the Middle East, but could not talk an issue that is right in its backyard? That's a mind-boggling question. And so when we try to knock in the door of ASEAN, you cannot force ASEAN to do something that it doesn't want. At the end of the day, it's a dumb if you do, dumb if you don't situation for you. As you wait until ASEAN could come up with a solution, you keep on losing your maritime space and territories. What do you do, actually? At the end of the day, if ASEAN does not want to take this, we have to do it for our own. Without blaming anybody, we did not blame anybody, or we did this on our own. It's also not correct to say that we did not consult because as early as 2 years ago, the Philippines has already sounded the possibility of bringing this to arbitration. In fact, we have extended that invitation to our good friend in the north, actually. And so this has been in the table. The question is, if the COC, all tracks that you try to put on the table are not working, in the meantime, this is happening on the ground to you, are you going to wait 10 years from now? Maybe by that time, status quo, quote unquote, would have changed. Going back to the status quo, for example, what is the status quo during the DOC? What do we mean by management of disputes so they don't escalate? These are abstract ideas. How do you operationalize that in the context of the DOC, which was intended as a management tool and supposedly would have stopped the so-called assertion right in the mischief reef? Why was it not able to prevent this? Who made the first move in trying to disregard the DOC? So these are questions. My final point, actually on, I know it's too long, but on the statement that Singapore, this is something factual because even the PowerPoint showed this, that the statement is 2012. I noticed our arbitration was done in 2013, actually. That statement referred to another issue. It's not directly related to what we did in January. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we have lots of questions and points there, and primarily directed, I think, to you, Professor Huang. So I'd like to kick off.
I said that question and answers is my opinion, but I also said that I agree with my colleague, Professor Feng Yu on this. So therefore, I have obligation to defend him, and also in my opinion. First, about, yes, comparing to China, Philippines is a small power, and by logic, it doesn't make any sense for weaker party to initiate the fight because that's suicidal at best. So therefore, you said the Philippines cannot open fire first. I agree. But however, you also remember when the tension started, China is resourceful enough to send in the so-called civilian Coast Guard without any equipment, but Philippines send in the largest warship it has. And that, of course, raises some attention in countries like Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, and so on and so forth. But like I said again, China is so big, China can't afford to hold his hand back, just use a pulley to push you out of this. So therefore, I do not think it's absolutely impossible that a weaker party will not fire first, because fire first may not be an intentional act, could be accidental, like I said. And that's the first question. The second is that bypass ASEAN. I believe, like I said in my presentation, I have a very detailed discussion with Yikon on this. Yikon emphasized, if you read his paper, I also emphasize that we believe that Philippines exhausted all the ways, try to find a way to go, but all of this are in vain. That's why it's a last resort. I repeat, I said it's a last resort for Filipinos to seek a peaceful solution on the dispute. So I think that's fully understandable. But having said that, does not mean that the bypass ASEAN, this kind of statement does not hold water. Because from Singapore's view, and first, Filipinos did not really reach to make a serious effort to have ASEAN's universal agreement for Filipinos to do it first. And secondly, as you understand, the Filipinos are not on the same page. And the different Filipinos come to tell people different stories. And that is also the case, and like in all the politics. So as a result, it is not a kind of agreement, at least from other ASEAN members' perspective, that Filipinos has fully consulted ASEAN member countries. Again, like I said, there's only one truth, But the problem is that people look at the truth from different perspectives, and therefore they have different explanations, different opinions. That's my second answer. The second questions. The third about how can ASEAN maintain this centrality while they cannot even handle the problem right at its backyard. It's not backyard in my view. It's the heart of ASEAN, and so therefore that leads to another question that the deadline for COC is 2012, and Philippines went to international court in 2013. That is, Philippines is patient enough and realize there's no way, even for management, code of conduct management, China does not get involved. So that's a fact. But on the other hand, I mean, it is exactly because ASEAN centrality is so important, so critical for ASEAN survival. That's why from the very beginning of DOC and COC, ASEAN made it very clear that DOC or COC is not any kind of solution to the problem. It's only provide, number one, is called code of conduct. That means to manage the issue so that it will not escalate into a major crisis. Number two, to provide a platform that the involved parties can reach agreement, which will lead to an eventual solution of the problem. So that's why there's a very limited role ASEAN want to play, and that is exactly because ASEAN to maintain the centrality.
Yes.
I think it's almost a definitional issue, that bypass on the slide, because it did follow about exhaustion, and I think maybe at least the three of us agree that Philippines did exhaust all of its options before it decided to bypass, if you want to use that word at that point. It's kind of a definitional thing, I think. On the point about Singapore, factually, you're right. I mean, indisputable. But I will say that the Singaporeans' reaction to the Filipino submission was pretty neutral. As far as if you know better, I'd like to understand it. But it was neutral. The only time I can remember the Singaporeans taking a less neutral position is in 2011 when a Chinese vessel on its way to port in Singapore had some reporters on board, and those reporters made some comments putting the voyage in the context of China's claims to the South China Sea. That just put Singapore in a very awkward situation. They didn't want to say anything. They would rather not have, but being put in that situation, they had to come out. And at that point, they said China should clarify its claims in the South China Sea, which turned out to be a very good thing for them to do. But they didn't do it really of their own initiative. It was a reaction to something.
I was interested in the suggestion that mediation be tried. Of course, as you know, in principle, China doesn't like mediation much better than arbitration or adjudication. Although when things are bad behind the scenes, without calling it mediation often, they do accept assistance from a party that can be helpful. Chinese are very practical people much of the time. But I'm more interested in exploring a little further, what do we mean by negotiation? We have these cliches. China wants to settle these questions through negotiation bilaterally. ASEAN wants to settle them multilaterally. But it seems to me it's a peg too high in abstraction. If we look more closely, let's say, look at Vietnam. Vietnam has settled two issues, land border, Gulf of Tonkin, bilaterally with China, and quite well. So why doesn't Vietnam then settle the Paracel dispute bilaterally? Well, I understand. China says there's no dispute, so there's nothing to negotiate. So China doesn't say, we want to negotiate it bilaterally. China says, we don't want to negotiate. Anyway, then what is Vietnam's response? I don't know. Has there been one? Vietnam occupies some of the Spratlys. China claims the Spratlys. Does Vietnam say there's nothing to negotiate because we occupy those islands? A kind of reciprocation or retaliation. And what does that mean about opening up a solution? How do you solve territorial disputes over islands? It's much harder to resolve a dispute over islands than over the Gulf of Tonkin. Water, it's much harder to resolve a dispute than over land boundaries. You've got much more possibility there. But for an island, how are you going to solve it if you are willing to negotiate? And that raises other possibilities. Horse trading, benefits that come in other ways, not necessarily directly involving land, splitting the difference. You take one island, I'll take another, or one part. We know international law offers many examples where this kind of thing has led to sharing islands. Sometimes you get really imaginative solutions. I'm just wondering, I think that would be, if we could focus on that level, what are the facts about the Spratlys, for example? And is it true that China won't negotiate the paracels? We haven't heard much about the paracels today.
Yeah, those are all really very tough questions. And also the most important ones, I think. I think we talked earlier about the difficult situation the Philippines is in terms of being the weakest power. But relatively speaking, all the ASEAN states are weak powers, especially militarily. The Vietnamese are too, relative to the Chinese. And in fact, I think the Vietnamese are in a much weaker position diplomatically because the Chinese own the paracels. Possession being 9/10 of the law. That's the problem with the Chinese taking possession of Scarborough Shoal or of Mischief Reef. I mean, once it's gone, it's gone. And I thought Henry's remarks last night about how we were quiet in 1974 and they were quiet in 1988, and now it's our turn. Philippines is drifting in that direction where it could be in a similar situation that Vietnam is in today. The topic for what we would do actually in international discussion, I think that the outcome of this Philippine case could change a lot. I mean, that's what makes it so important, because I agree with some of the earlier panelists, Professor Beckman, that the best prospect we have is that somehow the Chinese will begin to define their claims in terms that everyone else is defining their claims. And then we can have a common basis of discussion. I mean, it's only 5% of the way there, or 10% of the way there, but at least we're all talking about the same thing, and we can decide, is this an island, is this a rock? We're talking in similar terms. So, as unsatisfying as it is, maybe the territorial side of this is moving in, or could move in a positive direction. But I'm thinking of a international conference that could focus on some of the issues that ASEAN is failing at, like the code of conduct, or negotiation of an incidents at sea agreement. You have similar issues in the Indian Ocean with the Indians and the Chinese. You have similar issues in the East China Sea. Maybe that's what we need to work out, because that's where the real prospect for conflict is. The Chinese, I don't think anyone thinks the Chinese are going to invade Palawan anytime soon. The real problem is that somehow we're going to accidentally fall into conflict. The Chinese are going to fire on a Philippine armed vessels, which invokes the U.S. Treaty commitment to the Philippines. We don't necessarily, it's not an automatic trigger, but it immediately gets us talking about it. Or you don't have time, you don't have reaction times. That's part of the problem that's going on in the East China Sea right now, is this whole issue of painting helicopters and painting naval vessels cuts down the reaction time immediately. So we could be in the middle of a conflict before any of us know it, before we have a chance to go back and consult Washington. So I think we could do some constructive things that ASEAN right now is not able to do.
I think that non-negotiation board, negotiation boards depend on what you negotiate about. I think China and other countries like Philippines and Vietnamese, even though they are on two sides of the issue, they all agree on one issue, that is sovereignty is not negotiable. They don't want to negotiate on sovereignty. But having said that, doesn't mean that they do not negotiate on how to find a solution on the practical issues like fishery, like energy exploitation and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, as far as I know, the Chinese and Filipinos and Chinese Vietnamese are always in negotiation on the issues. To the Chinese, in my understanding, the dispute with Philippines actually is easier because Philippines as a nation, as a country, does not really have much fishery industry. But Philippines, most of the energy whales, oil whales are not exactly within the 9-dash line. So another example is Malaysia. If you look at it, Malaysia has almost 1,000 whales in the 9-dash line. So therefore, I was told that if Philippines will go easy on China on the fishery sense, for example, Philippines can negotiate with the Chinese how many fish boats can come in each week or each month, or the Chinese fish boat has to follow Filipinos' laws in terms of fishery. And China may go easy on Philippines on the energy issue. But the problem is that Philippines is a democracy. Whatever talked on the table will immediately be on the society. So at the end of the day, it turned out, ironically, both the Chinese leaders and the Philippine leaders are fighting for domestic issues, not internal. So in other words, their position is taken mostly for domestic support rather than find a solution. But for the Vietnamese, the issue becomes even more very, very difficult because Vietnamese has a very large fishery industry. 78% of Vietnam GDP come from fishery. And all the Vietnamese energy fields, 75% of them are in the heart of the 9-dash line. So it's difficult for China and Vietnam to cut a deal on those things. But advantage Vietnam has, Philippines does not, is that Vietnam has two channels talking to the Chinese. One is government to government, another is party to party. And it depends which channel you're talking about. And so therefore, my answer to Professor Cohen, your question is that when both sides say they are not going to negotiate, that means they are not going to negotiate a sovereignty, a claim to a territory. But as a matter of fact, negotiation is going on all the time.
But sovereignty
on practical issue.
Get negotiated even though people always say sovereignty is not negotiable. The fact is, it often is negotiable when, push comes to shove. And nobody's answered my factual question. Is it true that China rejects negotiation over paracels? What is the Vietnamese posture about possibly negotiating spreading? There must be facts about this. Can somebody answer?
Okay. Can we have a very quick answer because I've got lots more people with their hands up.
I could give you my best answer, but we have a couple of Vietnamese in the audience who probably give you a better answer, right? Why don't you...
Regarding your question about the possibility of regarding your question about the possibility of negotiation on the paracels, I already said that we, as Vietnam, we have made several proposals for many years to start negotiation with China on paracels, and maybe our Chinese colleagues here can testify that China would never agree to that. China would always say that paracels is not disputed. So it is, there is no question, no possibility for having a negotiation on paracels.
What's your view on the Spratly?
The Spratly?
Is that subject to negotiation?
Of course, yes.
Sovereignty?
We haven't been able to come together as claimants of the Spratly to discuss on sovereignty or on delimitation of the maritime entitlements of the features included in the Spratlys. That is a fact. And according to the position of my government, we say that every dispute must be settled by peaceful means in accordance with international law. And according to Article 33 of the United Nations Charter, peaceful means mean negotiation, means mediation, means adjudication, everything. Yes, arbitration, adjudication.
Okay, perhaps some of these discussions can carry on the sidelines of the conference where we have some of the parties present. Did you have a question over here? Okay, yes.
This is Jeannie Nguyen from Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I follow Dr. Lohman to say that it's been obvious that right at this moment when the tension is rising, ASEAN doesn't have the capacity needed to be the person or the institution to resolve that. We need to help ASEAN to build up that capacity. In the meantime, I agree with Dr. Lohman that we need to bring this to international community. And so at this moment, I would think that we need to find an equilibrium of powers. China obviously has been exerting its big power over the small countries like Vietnam and the Philippines. You heard the Philippines, the person who was raped. And we cannot see another situation happen like the paracel. In 1974, China invaded Vietnam right after we signed the Paris Agreement in 1973. So there's no trust in Chinese behavior. So then we need to have the safeguard of the international community. So I would suggest that to move forward at this moment, since India, Japan, South Korea, all are in Asia Pacific, and all will share the same impact of Chinese behavior in the maritime territory of Asia Pacific. Why don't we invite Japan, South Korea, India, and obviously we're talking about the US. We've been expecting the US to take leadership role to give China a clear engagement to support Chinese leadership to step in and talk to us in the global rule of law. So I would respectfully suggest that we move forward with Dr. Lohman's suggestions to bring this to a global table, because this forever will set the stage for the 21st century as a global rule of law. And Chinese leadership, in order to exert their rising power, they need to work with everyone. And they need to know that right now, the Philippines has voiced their concern, and Vietnam has suffered since 1974 until now. They took over the paracel, and they still don't talk about the paracel. And that's not acceptable to us. It's not acceptable. And we are weak countries, right? We've been trying to use peaceful resolution, but the Chinese leadership would not agree to it. So at this moment, it's obvious that ASEAN doesn't have the capacity. I suggest we go forward with Dr. Lohman's suggestions to bring it to the international table, and at the same time, see if we can build up ASEAN capacity. Because as Dr. Jing has made the point many times, ASEAN still is the leadership of the area of Southeast Asia, and we still provide the whole region with at least the representations of each nation, and at least the restraints, the certain common economic development, peace and security. So I feel that we need to move forward. And at this time, we need to bring it to a global scale, not just expecting ASEAN to just deal with China, because it's been obvious that China is exerting its power over ASEAN countries.
Okay, anybody want to respond to that?
Well, she agrees with me, I agree with her.
I would say that if you look from ASEAN's perspective, if we play the game like you suggested, bring the major powers into this issue, ASEAN is no longer ASEAN as it is. And you have to think from other ASEAN members. First, let me say that. from
Sorry, can I
ASEAN.
just...
I've been patient to listen to what you said. And if you talk with Thailand, talk with Indonesians, Malaysians, we have the representative here, I believe. Does ASEAN have a consensus, a universal ground or understanding that to bring these issues, quote and unquote, to the global level? I do not believe that has been agreed upon by the ASEAN countries. The reason is very simple. ASEAN's neutrality and ASEAN's consensus building principles will be totally ruined. So ASEAN will no longer be ASEAN if prematurely bring in the major powers first. And second, about bringing this game to the global level, I think you should ask the Vietnamese government right here if that is Vietnamese government's approach.
If I could just very quickly, in response to Dr. Huang's comments, is that I don't think the question is really whether ASEAN should reach out to the international community. This is, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the parties that have the problem, particularly the Filipinos, reach out to the international community and truly bypass ASEAN, because you're right, ASEAN won't do it. And it can't do it. It can't do it itself. It doesn't want anybody else to do it. Where does that leave us?
Okay.
I just have a comment. I guess that. Oh, sorry. My name is Lynn Kwok. I'm a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. I'm just wondering whether some of the answers to some of the suggestions posed would be resolved if we looked at the ultimate goal for the South China Sea. Are we looking at, as you suggest, Mr. Lohman, at resolving the issue for the individual countries who have grievances in this area, or is our ultimate goal really to maintain a stability within the South China Sea? So these are two very different objectives, and they might require two very different means of resolution. Internationalizing the problem might well help to resolve some of the grievances from the individual countries. So if Vietnam or the Philippines feels very aggrieved, reaching out to the international community might help them bolster their claim. But it might also destabilize the region, which is also against US interests, because then you have a powerful China feeling that, hey, the rest of the world is ganging up against me. And I'm not sure that that is also in the interests of the Southeast Asian countries. So while internationalizing the issue might well work in favor of the US in the short term, I'm not sure that it resolves anything in the long term. So, I mean, maybe you could respond to that.
I don't, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't see it destabilizing the region. I mean, I don't think the measure, yeah, I know, but I don't think that we can take as a measure everything the Chinese disagree with as something we shouldn't do. Or it might make them angry and it might destabilize the situation. You know, I also don't think that you can look at it as what the Southeast Asian countries want or what they don't want or what they're comfortable with. The truth is they all have different views on this. You know, some of them would be more comfortable with reaching out than others, and some of them are more sensitive to their relationship with the Chinese than the others.
But what about what ASEAN as an institution wants? Because from their perspective as well, they want to be able to
Right.
like they are able to manage the issue.
Right, but what I'm saying is they can't manage it, and so it's not up to them. And I don't think that the countries in the region should leave it up to them anymore. You know, it's fine for Indonesia or Singapore to leave it up to them. They have nothing in the game. The Philippines has territory in the game, and they can't continue to allow the boat to be driven by the Singaporeans and the Indonesians while their territory, or you know, I acknowledge it's disputed territory, but while that is settled in a coercive manner.
Okay, over here.
I'm Mr. Lloyd from Baltimore with Filipino roots. I fully agree with Ms. Dr. Huang Jing's position that we have to go into consensus building, things like that, all the good things you say about ASEAN, but we cannot drag on our feet for very, very long and have these things put in the shell for a long time at the expense of the Vietnamese and the Filipinos. We have to solve this once and for all. And the Philippine action, after exhausting all possible means and all legal procedures, I think the Philippines is just taking the right thing at the right time. If the Philippines did not do this, maybe we would still be dragging issue on the South China Sea for the next 10 or 20 years. And we could not sacrifice our issues just because we have to wait for whoever is on the driver's seat. As a Filipino, with roots in the Philippines, I feel shortchanged that ASEAN is not working too much, too hard for the time needed. Thank you.
Yes, and on the issues like this, one of the major problems as a human being is that the heart and mind do not go together. That's an issue. For example, when I started the Taiwan issue, I say the international community as a whole, the heart goes to Taiwan, mind goes to China. And on this issue, I can also, the heart goes to Filipinos, Vietnamese, whoever want to get this issue. I fully understand you feel you're shortchanged. I fully understand that you're a victim in this, facing a bullish China whatsoever. But the minds may not go to Philippines from ASEAN's point of view, because what you really want is a situation like Lin just said, that everybody can enjoy a peaceful environment. If, like this lady just suggested, we involve all the major powers in this game, in the hope or in the wish that issue can be solved, let me tell you what's going to happen. The issue will not be solved, but it will have a much, much bigger problem, because then the entire Southeast Asia will become the playground for major powers. Do you think Philippines as a small country can prevail, can be long-changed instead of short-changed in this kind of game where the major powers take the area as a playground for their own national interest, just like Ambassador Roy said very clearly last night? United States get involved on this issue is not for Philippines' interests, it's for Americans' interests. Do you think that in that kind of game, Philippines will now be shortchanged? I think you're dreaming.
My question is brief. What happens if the lawyers and the diplomats agree to disagree and everybody goes home, and there is a long period of quiescence and neglect? What would happen if everybody right now just went home?
Does everyone include the Chinese? Well, then we'd have peace. I mean, if everyone would just agree. I mean, ultimately, seriously, the Deng Xiaoping's formulas, pending some resolution of the actual territorial disputes, which I say could be, depending on how this Filipino case turns out, could be on a long time positive trend. Deng Xiaoping's solution is the best one, that is setting aside disputes and working to jointly develop resources. The problem is that China has disregarded that advice for the last, especially 4 or 5 years.
In the long run, of course, everybody can go home, but when they go home, they want to bring the resources with them, because one fact is that the Asian Pacific as a whole are undergoing a very fast industrialization process. What industrialization gave us is this irresistible hunger for resources and markets. That's why we have all those imperialism, colonialism happen. And as all the Asian countries go through this, they have to go through the process. That is how to negotiate a deal that no one can be shortchanged in this hunger or this kind of strive for resources in the market. And that's a game is very new to Asia. And because the fundamental dilemma for a human being from day one to the last day is unlimited demand versus limited resources.
Okay, can I take, I think, just one more question? Can I have the gentleman at the back?
Oh, Martin, here comes Martin.
Okay, Martin Rivlin, Columbia and CUNY. I agree with you about the internationalization, but kind of piggybacking on Jerry's question, what if you had someone who everyone agreed was a neutral party, like the Scandinavians, or maybe the Swiss, as Mr. Lohman suggests, certainly not Korea or Japan, involved in this as kind of mediator? I mean, how would that be as some kind of possibility, or some kind of new international organization which might be involved in this? I'm just wondering how you'd react to that.
as a matter of fact, and I'm not a lawyer, whenever you get involved in a dispute like this, you already have a position, you already have interests. Because number one, we play by whose rule of rules, and whose rule is dominant in this kind of game. Number two, that this third party, so-called the neutral third party, as soon as they get involved, they have to take a position. Then that position will translate into interests. So as a result, it becomes even more complicated game. Only in one condition that the third party involvement can lead to a positive solution. That is, the third party can overwhelm both parties, can play a game of double deterrence.
Okay, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you very much for the extremely lively discussion, presentations, and I think we've had a very good airing of diverse points of view.